people like me. You need people like me so you can point your f***ing fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Andy Ruiz versus Luis Ortiz. Let's talk about the fight. As far as the aesthetic of the match and how it looked once both boys were in the ring, it was more or less what I expected, though it didn't end.
Didn't end exactly as I expected.
Luis Ortiz, the veteran fighter, the aging fighter, got off to a pretty decent start, landing several straight left hands down the pipe while he was still fresh in the early goings of this match.
Luis Ortiz, the southpaw.
Pawing with that jab hand, that right hand, in order to set up that straight left, navigating the ring.
His legs looked better than I thought they would.
And there's still enough power in those hands and snap on those shots to have gotten Andy Ruiz Jr.'s respect. I think for the most part, Luis Ortiz did give Andy Ruiz something to think about whenever he did connect with that backhand, that straight left hand.
Landed it a few times in the early goings of this fight.
Luis Ortiz, he got off to a decent start in the first. Things took a turn for the worst for him in the second round, where he was dropped 2 times off of hard shots mid-range to inside from Andy Ruiz, who showed he still got mustard on that hot dog. He still got power in those hands.
Second round was a 10-7 round for Andy Ruiz, a pivotal round, an important round.
I was right to assume that Andy Ruiz would retain his speed and power in this match. In the second round, that was evident. Mid-range to inside, Andy Ruiz is a lethal combination puncher, and Luis Ortiz's best punches being his straight punches, not his bent arm punches, not his hooks. Mid-range to inside, in the pocket, Andy Ruiz would have the advantage, and he did in the second round when he scored those 2 knockdowns. The task for Andy would be getting there, getting mid-range to inside on a statuesque,
a taller fighter with a height advantage and a reach advantage and a judicious jab out of the southpaw stance.
Those are some of the elements that made it a rather tricky situation for Andy to get mid-range to inside, get into his sweet spot in order to land those hard shots on Luis Ortiz. But he was able to do so in the second round, and he scored 2 knockdowns, a 10-7 round for Andy.
Luis Ortiz showed good powers of recovery,
as Andy Ruiz was unable to finish, unable to close the show in the second round in spite of scoring those 2 knockdowns. Don't forget that ahead of this fight, Andy Ruiz was a fighter that was coming off a year of inactivity, a little over a year. The last time Andy saw action was in May of last year against Chris Arreola.
Whereas Luis Ortiz was a little bit more active in the last 12 months. He saw action earlier this year against former IBF champion Charles Martin.
I feel like had Andy been a little bit more active in the last 12 months, he would have been a little bit sharper for it, more well-conditioned, and he would have been able to close the show as opposed to going the distance with Luis Ortiz, who he clearly had enough power to hurt, enough power to knock down,
though still lacking the sharpness to knock out.
He scored 2 knockdowns in the second round, 3 overall.
He scored another one later on.
I think if not for the ring rust, Andy would have been able to close this show early.
Credit to the old-timer Luis Ortiz, who hung in there and showed good powers of recovery, got back on his feet, and got back in the fight.
Picked up a few rounds along the way, got some licks in here and there. I want to say that Luis Ortiz's most effective weapon in this fight just so happened to be the lead hand, the jab. There were quiet rounds that you could have given to Luis Ortiz on the premise that he was holding the center of the ring, backing Andy Ruiz into those ropes, and even if he wasn't landing those jabs, even if they weren't quite,
even if those jabs weren't quite connecting, he still seemed the busier of the 2 in spots. He still seemed the busier of the 2.
Well, in some rounds he was, and in some rounds he wasn't. Other times, you saw Andy Ruiz getting off cleaner, clearer shots. Even if he wasn't the busier puncher per se, he was the cleaner, more effective puncher in other rounds.
Even in those moments where Luis Ortiz was attempting to walk Andy Ruiz down,
getting on his southpaw jab and pawing with it as to bring over a big straight left hand. You saw that there were moments where Andy's getting off the clearer shots, clean counter shots off the back foot and moving laterally.
It's important to note that the rounds where Andy scored knockdowns weren't the only rounds that he banked. There were other rounds where he was showing clearer work, clearer, more effective punches.
And that coupled with the 2 knockdowns early in the fight and the subsequent knockdown he scored later on towards the tail end of it is really what saved this fight for Andy.
There were lulls in the action and quiet moments. At times the action seemed far and few between the fighters. It was a tense affair.
More of a nail biter than a barn burner, as you got the sense that both boys can hurt each other, and they know that. So they are giving each other that much consideration, that much respect. Andy Ruiz was weary of the counter shots and weary of the straight left hand from Luis Ortiz, and Luis Ortiz knew he's got to keep this guy at arm's length. He's got to keep him on the outside as best as he can, not just to bring over that straight left hand, but to prevent him from getting off shots mid-range to inside, which just so happens to be Andy Ruiz's sweet spot.
Luis Ortiz's legs looked better than I thought they would.
Though his punch resistance was more or less what I anticipated, more or less what I expected. I figured as soon as Andy is able to connect with a hard shot, Luis Ortiz is likely going to hit the deck because his punch resistance, it is waning.
His power is too a bit. He might have landed several straight left hands that got Andy Ruiz's attention, but he didn't score any knockdowns.
Andy did. There was enough on that straight left hand from Luis Ortiz to get Andy Ruiz's attention and his respect, but not enough to floor him. Andy Ruiz...
He got his head snapped back a couple of times.
But Andy Ruiz is known for having a good chin, having a good beard, and taking world-class punch.
I want to say Luis Ortiz started off all right and finished strong in the 12th round.
After a punishing 11th round at the hands of Andy Ruiz, the 11th round was quite clearly an Andy Ruiz round, whereas the 12th and final round was clearly a Luis Ortiz round, as he had Andy Ruiz.
It looked like he had him hurt, and he definitely had him on the run, landing several clean shots.
Towards the finish, Luis Ortiz took a lot of hard shots in the 11th, and Andy Ruiz took a lot of hard shots in the 12th, weathered the storm, survived it, and secured a unanimous decision. A more active Andy Ruiz would have been able to close the show.
If he weren't shaking off ring rust in this fight, I think he could have finished him early.
Your guess is as good as mine as to why the PBC didn't get this guy a fight in the last 12 months. Why have they shelved him for so long?
He tried to have a fight on Triller earlier this year against unbeaten kickboxer, turned boxer Tyrone Spong.
They pulled him out of that. But for the schedule that they've kept him on, the gap in between fights, they didn't get him anything else to do in the in-between time. There was enough time there that he could have had the Spong fight. Maybe he knocks that guy out and then goes into the Ortiz fight a bit sharper for it because he needed those rounds.
I guess they were afraid that Tyrone Spong might upset the apple cart, or they just don't want their fighter fighting on another platform. It is what it is.
He won the fight. I said he'd win the fight, and there it is. Now attention turns to a potential Deontay Wilder showdown, a battle of the former champions, potentially, should Deontay make it past Robert Helenius. And I think he can. I think he will. I think the Robert Helenius fight is an ideal fight for a fighter under Deontay Wilder's circumstances, to where he's taken 2 systematic beatings
2 of them
within the last 2 years, and he needs a rebound fight, a confidence-building fight, to where he can get his juices going again and remind himself what he's capable of. Robert Helenius is a decent boxer. He has decent boxing ability, but don't forget, this is a guy who was stopped in his prime by Johan Duhaupas. More recently, he was stopped by Gerald Washington, who's really not known for power.
It's a good fight on paper because Robert's coming off of 2 consecutive wins.
But there's more to boxing than what you see on paper. There's more to boxing than what you see in the fine print. Ruiz is open to facing Wilder next. He says, we're both in the same organization. Heyman can make the fight happen. And beyond the Helenius fight, which I expect Wilder to win.
Yeah, maybe Robert banks a few of the early rounds before he gets stopped, but I do think he's going to get stopped.
God willing, he wins against Robert in October. Me and him are in the same organization, Ruiz told Fox Sports' Heidi Androl, after earning his second straight win, pointing out their alliance with Premier Boxing Champions. I want to thank Al Heyman. He can make this fight happen. Let's do it.
They will. They'll do it next year.
If you remember the two Adam Kovnowski fights, the initial beating that Robert laid on then unbeaten Adam Kovnowski, and how Robert approached the second fight, he didn't necessarily lay into Adam Kovnowski straight away. He boxed him and set him up for shots, set him up for punches, because not a lot about Adam was going to change in between those two fights. But you'll notice that he didn't get right at him.
He didn't jump right on him straight away.
He boxed him. And if you're going to be cautious with a guy that you've already beaten, well, I don't give you much chance of beating Deontay, because you've got to get mid-range to inside on Deontay to disarm him.
You've got to take the initiative, and you've got to crowd him.
If there's enough distance between you and him to where he can get full extension on that arm to deliver that right hand, that's what he's going to do, and you're going to be there for it.
You can't give this guy room to throw it. You've got to crowd him, put him on his back foot, and disarm him.
Don't give him enough space to deliver that punch. I don't trust Robert Helenius to do that. He didn't do that with Adam Kovnowski. I don't think he's going to do that with an even bigger, taller puncher in Deontay Wilder. So I do have Robert Helenius getting smoked, getting stopped. Maybe he banks a couple of rounds before it happens, but I think it ends the same way.
It'll end the same way the Spilka fight ended.
And the win will leave Wilder and Ruiz at 1 and 2 in the WBC rankings, and seemingly with a plan to face each other while Fury negotiates an undisputed championship clash with unified titleist Alexander Usyk. Deontay Wilder's back. He's always looking for greatness, Wilder said of such a fight. That's what he loves to give fight fans. If that's what's lined up next, I've got to handle business. But after that, we can get it on.
And they will. How long have I been telling you this is the plan? How long ago was it when I told you Wilder's going to fight Robert Helenius?
He didn't fight on Deontay Wilder's undercard by accident. That was by design. And how long ago did I tell you that Ruiz was going to fight Ortiz, and he's likely going to beat him, and the winners of these two fights will...
That's what they're going to do, a battle of the former champions on pay-per-view next year. There is a question as to which network will carry the show.
Andy Ruiz's fight was on Fox pay-per-view. Deontay Wilder's next fight is on Fox pay-per-view, but Fox is rumored to be leaving boxing beyond this year. In fact, the story is they're not spending any of their own money on production. They're just giving the PBC slots.
The money in order to put these shows together is essentially coming from the PBC themselves.
That's the story, according to boxing scribe Marcos Villegas. You guys know how this works. A promoter enters into a deal with a broadcast partner. The broadcast partner then gives them a budget, footing the bill for their shows throughout the year.
The money comes from the network, and the promoter puts the shows together with that money
and makes those shows happen. But if Fox is no longer footing the bill for these shows, how's the PBC making them happen? Well, they're putting them on pay-per-view, hoping that me and you will foot the bill. What are shows that should be on regular Fox or regular Showtime are ending up on pay-per-view to help pay for the show.
Because Fox doesn't want to. They don't want to pay for the shows.
That's why these otherwise ordinary run-of-the-mill fights are being billed as pay-per-views. Fights like Ortiz versus Martin, Ruiz versus Ortiz, or Thurman versus Barrios.
Those fights aren't box office. They're not supposed to be.
But they end up there in order to help pay for the operational costs overall. That's what the PBC's deal with Fox has been reduced to. And if Fox is in fact set to leave boxing beyond this year, once their contract with the PBC is up, who's going to stage Wilder versus Ruiz? Would be Showtime, presumably.
The PBC's other broadcast partner.
Hell, that's assuming they don't enter into another deal with another broadcaster. I heard rumors and rumblings about some kind of Paramount deal. Nothing official, but we have to assume that if Fox is in fact leaving boxing, they won't be the ones that carry this fight.
But why wouldn't they want to renew their contract with the PBC? If they are leaving, why is that?
Well, listen, I'm no fortune teller, but if that's the way it works out, to where Fox decides not to renew their contract with the PBC, it would have to be because they've been burned too many times. They didn't get out of the deal what they thought they were going to get out of the deal.
Perhaps they didn't get the ratings that they were expecting to get, or they didn't make the money that they were expecting to make. It could be any number of things.
It all equates to the same thing. If Fox chooses not to renew their deal with the PBC, it would have to be because Fox doesn't feel that the PBC delivered, that the PBC held up their end of the bargain.
Otherwise, they would have decided to renew under better terms, better circumstances.
What pay-per-views have taken place on Fox? They didn't necessarily put up earth-shattering numbers, did they? Errol Spence Jr.'s pay-per-views haven't cracked 300,000 buys since the Mikey Garcia fight, and that was his pay-per-view debut. The Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury rematch, which Fox was a part of, is rumored to have lost money due to piracy. The third fight between them, that brought in even less pay-per-views than the second one did. So maybe Fox...
You don't actually think they made any money off of fights like Thurman versus Barrios or Ortiz versus Martin?
Andy Ruiz versus Chris Arreola. Do you think anybody made any money off of that in last night's fight, which seemed to have a good turnout in terms of an audience, in terms of attendance? Though, what did it do at the box office? What did it do on pay-per-view?
No, I don't think for a second they did earth-shattering numbers with that thing. Not enough numbers to where Fox might decide to renew the deal.
Not sure what's going to happen, but if things keep going the way they're going, and Fox really is set to leave boxing, you have to wonder who is going to be the distributor for a Deontay Wilder versus Andy Ruiz pay-per-view. In that situation, it would presumably be Showtime, who still is the PBC's broadcast partner, assuming the PBC doesn't get a new one, another one. Irrespective of platform issues, I do expect this fight to happen. I do expect to see the PBC get this fight over the line. A fight between Deontay and Andy Ruiz, contrasting styles. Of the two, Andy would be the busier puncher, though neither one of these boys is all that busy a puncher overall.
But Andy is busier than Deontay. Deontay spends an entire round looking to land a single punch, a single shot.
He's not a combination puncher. Andy is, but Andy's Achilles heel is that he needs to get mid-range to inside in order to let go of those combinations. He's lethal mid-range to inside, but he's got to get there. And in order to get there, he may have to come under fire. Heavy fire.
Can Andy Ruiz eat a straight right hand from Deontay Wilder? Andy's got a chin.
Yeah, he's got a chin, but how many of those can he actually absorb? How many can he actually take? Andy Ruiz has slow feet, you understand. He's always had slow feet.
To avert danger and avert disaster in a Deontay Wilder fight, he'll have to crowd him, get close to him.
It will take a burst of energy, a burst of explosivity to get mid-range to inside on Deontay, slip and slide around the jab, perhaps get under and around the straight right hand that he's sure to fire as Andy attempts to close the gap, to put combinations together, salvos of punches.
There's no guarantees that Andy Ruiz can do that because Andy ate a number of straight left hands from Luis Ortiz last night.
And he took them well, but I don't think there's as much pop on those straight left hands from Ortiz as what he might
endure at the hands of Deontay Wilder. Deontay Wilder's right hand. I think Wilder's right hand is a lot stronger than Ortiz's left.
Andy had some ring rust and cobwebs he had to shake off yesterday. You have to factor that into the equation. Deontay Wilder will be shaking off the ring rust and cobwebs as well against Robert Helenius. So if and when they meet,
Andy may be sharper the next time we see him, if this Wilder fight gets over the line, and Deontay,
depending on what he shows us in the fall, what he shows us in the Robert Helenius fight, if he does look a little rusty, if he does look a little off, if he makes it through it, he will be sharper for it the following year, having gotten those rounds in the bank, the year off to recover and recuperate from the Tyson Fury fight.
It's an interesting matchup, it is, because Deontay's no good mid-range to inside.
Andy Ruiz is susceptible to straight punches from the outside.
Not having the fastest feet to close the gap, he's going to have to fight on a swivel if he is to stand any chance.
He's better off fighting on a swivel, keeping that head off center, moving that torso instead of absorbing the shot on the arms and gloves should Deontay let go of the right hand. You don't want to be there when that happens.
Being honest, it is a very interesting fight. It is.